In the year 2024, in the dark heart of Chicago, where gleaming skyscrapers cast their shadows over forgotten slums, Valentina Mendez, a woman branded by a past as a forced prostitute that the underworld would never let her forget, was scrubbing bloodstains off the marble floors of the underground casino The Black Diamond at 3 a.m, while enduring the invisible weight of being no one, nothing, just another ghost the powerful walked past without a glance. Abandoned like garbage 5 years ago when she dared to get pregnant, she alone raised her little daughter Mia, only 5 years old, accepting humiliation as the price of survival in a territory ruled by devils. On that freezing November night, while her cracked hands raw from chemicals were cleaning stains no one bothered to explain, Val could never have imagined that her little girl, wandering the forbidden hallways, searching for her mother, was about to discover a man chained in the basement of the casino, a man the entire city feared, and even less could she have foreseen that this encounter would forever change the fate of them all, proving that the most improbable salvation can be born from the hands that the world insists on discarding. If this story touched your soul, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of this journey, because in the darkest shadows, the most powerful love stories are waiting to be told. The clock on the wall pointed to 6 a.m. when Val finally set the bucket down, her back aching as if someone had pressed an entire slab of stone against her spine for 8 straight hours. She straightened up slowly, her knees cracking softly, her hands numb from being soaked too long in cold water mixed with chemicals. Around her, the Black Diamond Casino had fallen silent. The powerful had already left in their luxury cars, abandoning behind them the stains, the shattered bottles, and the invisible people like Val who were left to clean up the ruins of the night's excess. She changed out of her janitor uniform in the cramped staff room, pulled on the thin coat with frayed shoulders she had bought from a thrift store 3 years earlier, then stepped out into the alley behind the casino where people like her were allowed to enter and exit. The November wind of Chicago cut into her skin like a blade. Val curled in on herself inside the coat that wasn't warm enough and hurried through streets, still swallowed by darkness. She walked 4 blocks every day because she didn't have money for the bus, 4 blocks through alleys filled with trash and the stench of urine, where addicts huddled against walls and rats darted past without fear of people. This was the South Side, the forgotten land of Chicago, where police didn't bother to patrol and the law was a luxury no one dared to dream of. Val quickened her pace as she passed a group of men smoking outside a closed bar. She lowered her head, avoided every gaze, made herself invisible the way she had learned to do over many years. At last she reached the old apartment building where she lived, its concrete stairs eaten away, its peeling walls covered in graffiti, the air thick with dampness, and the sour smell of spoiled food. She climbed to the 3rd floor and stopped in front of apartment 37, knocking lightly 3 times by habit. The door opened, and Abuela Carmen stood there, her silver hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck, her aged eyes still warm as they looked at Val the way one looks at a daughter they never had. She was a Puerto Rican woman who had lived in this neighborhood for more than 40 years, widowed, childless, and the only person in the world who didn't look at Val with contempt. They had met 5 years earlier on a freezing winter night when Val, pregnant and desperate, had been thrown out by Rico Santino and collapsed unconscious right in front of Carmen's door. Abuela Carmen had saved her, let her stay for 2 weeks, helped her give birth to Mia in this cramped room, when no hospital would take in a girl with no insurance and no money. Since then, they had become each other's family. 2 women abandoned by the world leaning on one another to survive. Every night Val went to work, Carmen watched Mia, and in return Val washed clothes and cleaned the apartment for her without charge. No money ever changed hands, only trust and quiet gratitude. The baby slept well, Abuela Carmen whispered, stepping aside to let Val in. She drew pictures of you before bed and said she missed her mother. Val walked to the old sofa where Mia lay curled beneath a thin blanket, her black hair spread across the pillow, her angelic face peaceful in sleep. Val sat beside her daughter and gently stroked her hair, her heart tightening with love and with guilt. Mia was everything she had, the only reason she got up each day, the only light in this dark life. But Val knew she was failing her child. She knew their damp 1-room apartment wasn't warm enough for winter. She knew her daughter's meals were often nothing more than instant noodles and cheap bread. She knew Mia had no toys except for a torn stuffed bear someone had thrown away and Val had picked up. "You should go home and rest," Abuela Carmen said softly, placing a hand on Val's shoulder. "You look exhausted." Val nodded and carefully lifted Mia into her arms. The little girl slept on, her head resting against her mother's shoulder. Val thanked Carmen with her eyes, then stepped back into the hallway and climbed one more floor to her own apartment, number 42. The room was suffocatingly small, holding only a single bed the two of them shared, an old gas stove, a toilet without a door, and a window that faced the brick wall of the neighboring building. Val laid Mia down on the bed, tucked the blanket around her, then sat on the cold floor with her back against the wall. She was too tired to sleep, too tired to cry, too tired to think about the future. Outside, dawn was rising over Chicago, but the light never reached rooms like hers. 3 days after that night, Mia began to cough. Small coughs at first, then gradually growing heavier, accompanied by a fever that made her forehead burn like hot coals. Val laid her hand on her daughter's forehead at 4 in the afternoon, her heart tightening as she felt the heat spreading through that fragile skin. She didn't have money for medicine, didn't have health insurance, didn't have any way to take her child to a hospital without being thrown out like a stray dog. Val rushed to Abuela Carmen's apartment, but the old woman was sick as well, arthritis tormenting her so badly she couldn't get out of bed. "Bring Mia here," Abuela Carmen said weakly. "I'll try to watch her." But Val looked at her, at the trembling hands and the pale face, and she knew she couldn't. Mia needed someone alert, someone who could run for help if the fever turned dangerous. That night, Val had no choice but to bring her child to the casino. She wrapped Mia in the thickest blanket they owned and carried her through 4 blocks of knife-sharp wind, whispering into her ear that everything would be all right, even though she didn't believe her own words. When she reached the Black Diamond, she slipped in through the back door for employees and took Mia into the narrow staff break room at the end of the first-floor hallway. The room held only a torn old sofa, a cabinet of cleaning supplies, and a dim yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling. Val laid her daughter down on the sofa, placed a damp cloth on her forehead to ease the fever, then knelt beside her, gripping Mia's small hand. "Listen to me," Val said, her voice firm but shaking. "You have to stay in this room and not go outside for any reason. Do you understand? This place is dangerous. I'll come check on you every hour. Promise me." Mia nodded weakly, her large brown eyes full of trust as she looked at her mother. Val kissed her forehead, then stepped out and closed the door, her heart heavy as stone as she began her shift. The hours crawled by like torture. Val worked while her thoughts never left Mia. She ran back to the break room every hour as she had promised, and each time she found her daughter asleep, the fever seeming to ease. But at 2 in the morning, when Val returned for the 5th time, the sofa was empty. The blanket was still there, still warm, but Mia was gone. Val's heart seemed to stop. She burst into the hallway, her eyes sweeping every corner, forcing herself not to scream for fear of drawing attention. She searched the restrooms, the changing rooms, the kitchen, but her child was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Mia had woken at 1:30 in the morning, the fever leaving her thirsty and frightened when she didn't see her mother. She stepped out of the room to look for Val, but the long hallway with its identical doors led her astray. She walked on, turned right, then left, distant music drifting down from somewhere above, the heavy smell of cigarettes and alcohol making her want to cough. Then she saw a stairway leading down, dark and cold, and Mia thought perhaps her mother was down there, perhaps cleaning some room she didn't know about yet. She went down step by step, her small hand clinging to the damp wall, her heart pounding in her chest. This basement was nothing like the rest of the casino. There were no red carpets or glittering chandeliers, only dull gray concrete, rusted pipes running along the ceiling, and a musty odor mixed with something else Mia couldn't recognize, the metallic scent of dried blood. She reached the end of the corridor, where a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar, weak yellow light spilling through the crack. Mia pushed the door open, stepped inside, and froze. In the dim room, lit by a single flickering bulb, a man sat slumped against the wall, his arms and legs bound by thick iron chains fastened to hooks in the concrete. His clothes were torn, his face covered in bruises and dried blood, a rough beard shadowing his square jaw, but his eyes, storm gray like the sky before a tempest, burned bright when he saw the little girl standing in the doorway. Mia didn't know who she was looking at. She didn't know this man was Nathaniel Corsetti, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, the man the entire city feared. She only saw someone wounded, imprisoned, and alone, like the stray dogs she often saw in the alleys, chained and left to starve until they died. The man looked at Mia, and in that instant the cold gray of his eyes changed, something piercing through as if a knife had just been driven into his chest. He didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't do anything a desperate prisoner would normally do when faced with a chance of escape. Instead, His voice came out rough but firm. "Little girl, you have to leave here right now. This place is dangerous." Mia didn't run. She stood there, tilting her head, looking at him with wide brown eyes that held no fear. Only curiosity, and something like compassion, that only children can keep intact in a brutal world. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Are you crying?" Nathaniel Corsetti, the man who had ordered the deaths of countless enemies without blinking, the man whose name made all of Chicago tremble, suddenly didn't know how to answer a question from a 5-year-old child. Before he could say anything, heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor, growing closer, accompanied by the crude laughter of 2 men. Nate's eyes widened. He looked toward the door, then back at Mia, his voice turning urgent while remaining strangely calm. "Hide behind that wooden crate," he said quickly, jerking his head toward the corner where a large wooden box sat. "Don't make a sound until they leave. No matter what happens, you can't come out. Do you understand?" Mia nodded, the survival instinct she had learned from years in the slums, making her obey at once. She ran to the corner and curled herself behind the crate, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her heart pounding. The steel door flew open and 2 guards walked in, the stench of alcohol and cigarettes following them. One was tall and thin, the other short and heavy, both carrying guns at their sides and cruel smiles on their faces. The great boss, the tall one, sneered, kicking Nate hard in the stomach and doubling him over. "What now? Do you know where you're going tomorrow night? You're going to disappear. No one will ever find your body, and Carlo will sit on your throne." The shorter one laughed along and spat in Nate's face. "I heard you used to kill people without blinking. Look at you now, like a chained dog. This is priceless." Nate said nothing. He simply lifted his head, his gray eyes locking onto the 2 men with a chill so frightening it was as if he were memorizing every line of their faces for revenge later. The guards laughed a bit more, kicked him a few more times for fun, then left, their footsteps fading down the corridor. When the door closed and silence returned, Mia crawled out from hiding, her eyes red and brimming. "Are you okay?" she whispered, stepping closer and looking at the fresh bruises on his body. "Did the bad men hurt you a lot?" Nate looked at her, and for the first time in 3 days of captivity, he felt something other than despair and hatred. This child reminded him of someone, a 4-year-old boy with eyes like his, a boy who loved strawberry ice cream and dinosaurs, a boy who called him Dad every morning when he woke up, a boy who had died in an explosion 3 years earlier, along with his mother, leaving a hollow inside Nate that nothing could fill. "I'm fine," he said, his voice softening in a way that surprised even him. "You have to go back to your mother right now. Don't tell anyone you were here. Promise me." Mia nodded, but before turning away, she paused, slipped her hand into the pocket of her pajama top, and pulled out a small candy wrapped in red paper, the candy Abuela Carmen had given her before she got sick. She placed it on the floor, right beside Nate's chained hand. "Mom says candy makes it hurt less," Mia said, a small smile blooming on her lips. "Eat it. You'll feel better." Then she turned and ran, her tiny figure disappearing beyond the steel door. Nate stared at the candy, his gray eyes trembling, and for the first time in 3 years, tears slid down his cheeks. His son had done this too, had handed him a piece of candy whenever he came home exhausted from long meetings, saying candy makes Dad happier. He had thought that softness in him was dead, but it turned out it had only been sleeping, waiting for a strange child to wake it. Mia ran back through the dark hallway, climbed the stairs, and found her way back to the staff break room by the instinct of a child long used to fending for herself. She had just sat down on the sofa when the door flew open and Val burst in like a storm, her eyes bloodshot with worry and fear. "Mia." Val dropped to her knees in front of her daughter, both hands gripping the little girl's shoulders, her voice shaking between relief and panic. "Where did you go? I looked for you everywhere. Do you know how scared I was?" Mia looked at her mother, her wide eyes still carrying a trace of fear from what she had just seen. "Mom," she whispered, "I went to look for you, but I got lost. I went down the stairs and saw a man the bad people locked up in the basement. He was chained to the wall. Mom, like Mr. Johnson's dog that's chained in the yard and no one feeds." Val froze. The blood in her veins seemed to stop. She knew that basement. Everyone who worked at the Black Diamond knew it. It was forbidden ground, the place where traitors or troublemakers were taken and never came back up. No one talked about it, no one admitted it existed, and no one dared to step down there unless ordered. "You can't tell anyone that," Val said, her voice so sharp that Mia flinched. "Do you hear me? Not a single person. This is a dangerous place, and if they find out you went down there, if they know you saw." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bear to think of the consequences. "But Mom," Mia said, tears starting to roll down her cheeks, "he's going to die. I heard the bad men say tomorrow night he'll disappear. They hit him, Mom, they kicked his stomach, and he didn't cry, but I know it hurt a lot." Val wanted to cover her ears, wanted to pretend she hadn't heard anything, wanted to grab her child and run from this place forever. But then Mia went on, her voice as small as breath. "He protected me, Mom. When the bad men came, he told me to hide. He was chained up, and he's still worried about me, Mom. You always say good people should help others. He's a good person." Val looked at her daughter, into those clear eyes filled with faith in the world, and felt something shatter in her chest. This child still believed in goodness, believed in justice, believed in things Val had abandoned long ago. How could she teach her that life wasn't fair, that good people died too, that sometimes surviving meant closing your eyes and looking away? That night, after taking Mia home and putting her to sleep beside Abuela Carmen, Val returned to the casino with her mind in chaos. She didn't know what she was doing when she walked toward the area near the basement, where Georgie, the old jailer, sat on a wooden chair reading a newspaper under a dim light. Georgie had worked here since before Val was born. He was one of the few who treated her like a human being instead of a ghost. He didn't judge her past, didn't look at her with desire or contempt, only nodded in greeting when she passed as if she deserved respect too. "Georgie," Val said, her voice so low she had to repeat it. "The man in the basement. Who is he?" Georgie lifted his head, his aged eyes sharp and probing, as if trying to read her soul. "You shouldn't ask," he said. "You shouldn't know. You should just clean and keep quiet like always." "I know," Val said, "but I need to know, please." Georgie studied her for a moment longer, then sighed, folded his newspaper, his voice dropping as if revealing a secret that could kill them both. "It's Nathaniel Corsetti, the boss, the man who owns this casino, these streets, this whole damn city. 3 nights ago, he was ambushed right in his office. His guards were all killed. Emilio, no one knows if he's alive or dead. The one behind it is Carlo Corsetti, his cousin, the bastard who teamed up with the Volkovs, the Russian Mafia, to steal the throne." Val felt the floor sway beneath her feet. She knew the name Nathaniel Corsetti. Who in Chicago didn't? He was the nightmare mothers used to scare their children, the dark shadow hanging over every underground deal in the city. But she also remembered something else, a rumor she had heard years ago, about him shutting down a human trafficking ring and punishing those who preyed on women in his territory. "Tomorrow night they'll finish him," Georgie went on, bitterness in his voice. "Then they'll announce he disappeared on a business trip. Carlo will take over, and no one will ever know the truth." "Why are you telling me?" Val asked, her voice trembling. Georgie looked at her, his old eyes suddenly flashing with something like desperate hope. "Because I swore loyalty to his father, because I can't do anything. But you're invisible. No one notices you. Sometimes the invisible can do what the powerful can't." Val returned to the apartment just as the sky began to pale, but she couldn't sleep. She lay beside Mia, watching the angelic face of her daughter in sleep, her mind spinning with everything Georgie had told her. Nathaniel Corsetti, the boss of all Chicago, was chained in the basement and would die the following night. It wasn't her problem. She was only a janitor, a ghost, an invisible woman with no power, no money, nothing except the little girl sleeping peacefully beside her. She didn't owe him anything. She had no reason to get involved, no reason to risk her life and Mia's life for a stranger, no matter who he was. And yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mia describing the man who had told her to hide when the guards came, the man who was chained and still thought about protecting a child he didn't know. Then her own memories came rushing back, memories she had tried to bury for years. Val remembered the winter night 5 years earlier, when she had been pregnant and beaten by Rico Santino and thrown into the street like a stray dog. She remembered kneeling on the frozen sidewalk, blood running from a wound on her head, begging passers-by for help. No one stopped, not a single person. They looked at her and turned away, walking faster as if her misery might be contagious. She remembered knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood, pleading for shelter for the night, and each door slamming shut in her face along with curses. "Whore, you deserve it. Don't bring trouble to my house." She had nearly died that night, nearly died along with the child in her womb, if Abuela Carmen hadn't happened to pass by and saved her. A stranger who didn't know who she was, didn't know her past, and still opened her door, gave her a place to sleep, gave her food, gave her hope. Just one person. Only one person who didn't turn away, and she had survived. Val opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling stained with damp patches. She thought about how if Abuela Carmen had walked past like everyone else, she and Mia wouldn't exist. She thought about how many people had died because no one reached out a hand. She thought about the man in the basement, betrayed by his own blood, waiting for death alone in darkness. He was a mafia boss, a man with blood on his hands, a monster the entire city feared. But he was also the man who had protected her daughter when he had no reason to, when he himself was chained and waiting to die. I don't owe him anything, Val whispered to herself in the dark. Then Mia's voice echoed in her mind, the voice of a 5-year-old who still believed in the goodness of the world. Mom always says good people should help others. Val closed her eyes, tears soaking into the pillow. She had taught her child that, yet she was now considering turning away, just like the people who had turned away from her 5 years earlier. Could she become one of them? Could she look into Mia's eyes every day, teach her about kindness and courage, while knowing she had let someone die out of fear? When dawn truly rose over Chicago, when weak light filtered through the dirty window, Val made her decision. She would help Nathaniel Corsetti, not because of who he was, but because she didn't want to be someone who turned away. It was the most reckless decision of her life, perhaps the last decision she would ever make, but at least she would be able to look in the mirror without feeling disgust for herself. That night, Val asked Georgie to let her go down to the basement under the pretense of cleaning. The old jailer studied her for a long moment, his aged eyes reading something in her gaze. Then he said nothing, simply handed her the key and nodded. In Val's hands was a small paper bag. Inside were bread she had bought with the last coins she had saved, a piece of cheese, and a bottle of clean water. It wasn't much, but it was everything she could bring without arousing suspicion. Her footsteps echoed through the dark basement corridor, her heart pounding so hard she felt as if anyone could hear it. When she reached the steel door, she stopped, drew a deep breath, then pushed it open and stepped inside. Nathaniel Corsetti lifted his head at the sound, his gray eyes flashing in the darkness like those of a trapped beast. But when he realized the person standing before him wasn't a guard, his gaze shifted, something like curiosity mixed with surprise crossing his face. "You're the child's mother," he said, his voice hoarse from days without water. Val froze, not expecting him to know. "How did you know?" "You have the same eyes as the girl," Nate replied, his gray eyes studying her without blinking. "And I saw you before, when you passed this room with a bucket in your hand 3 nights ago. You heard me groan, but you didn't stop, didn't look in, didn't get curious. You were afraid. People who are afraid like that usually have a lot to lose." Val stepped closer and set the paper bag down beside him. "My daughter said you protected her when the guards came. I'm here to repay a debt, nothing more." Nate looked at the bag but didn't touch it. "Do you know who I am?" "Nathaniel Corsetti, the boss, the man who owns this casino and this entire city." "Do you know what I've done to get that position?" Nate asked, his tone neither boastful nor threatening, but testing her, waiting to see if she would run. "How many people have died by my hand? How many families have been destroyed because of me? Do you know those things?" Val didn't step back. Her dark brown eyes met his gray ones steadily. "I don't care if you're a saint or a devil. You protected my child when you had no reason to do so, when you were chained and waiting to die. For me, that's enough." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable, as if two strangers were trying to read each other in the dark. At last, Nate bent forward, his chained hand trembling as he picked up the bottle of water. He drank like a man dying of thirst, water running down into his rough beard, then took the bread and ate slowly, as if trying to memorize the taste of being alive. "Tomorrow night they'll kill me," he said, after swallowing the last bite. "I know. You can't save me. You'll die too if they find out." "I know." "Then why?" Val sat down on the cold concrete floor facing him, unconcerned with dirt or dried blood, as if she were used to sitting in places others wouldn't dare to step. "Because no one ever saved me when I needed it," she said, her voice low and steady, without self-pity, only bare truth. 5 years ago I was beaten and thrown into the street in winter, pregnant, covered in blood. I knelt on the sidewalk begging passers-by to help me, and they walked past as if I didn't exist. I knocked on every door, and they slammed them in my face. I nearly died that night, nearly died along with the child in my womb." She paused and drew a deep breath. "Only one person stopped, an old woman who didn't know who I was or my past, but she saved me. Just one person. And I'm still alive today. Nate looked at her, and for the first time, the cold gray of his eyes wasn't cold anymore. They grew deep and wounded, as if he were seeing himself in her story. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softening in a way that surprised even him. "Valentina. People call me Val." "Valentina," he repeated, as if carving the name into his memory. "A beautiful name. It means strong, healthy. It seems your mother chose well. She hoped I'd be stronger than she was. She didn't know how strong life would demand me to be." Nate smiled, the first smile in many days, painful but real. And in that moment, two people abandoned by the world recognized each other, not as a mafia boss and a janitor, but as two human beings who had fallen to the bottom and were still struggling to rise. After that night, Val began to do something she had never imagined she would do. She began to look. For years working at the Black Diamond, she had learned how to be invisible, head lowered, eyes averted, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, knowing nothing. That had been the only way to survive in this world. But now she realized that invisibility itself could become a weapon. No one paid attention to a janitor kneeling to scrub the floor. No one bothered to lower their voice when a ghost pushed a cleaning cart past them. No one imagined that the ears hidden beneath tightly bound hair were listening to every word they said. On the first night after meeting Nate, Val asked to clean the 3rd floor, where Carlo Corsetti's office was located. She went there at 2 a.m, after Carlo had left following a long meeting, leaving behind half-finished glasses of liquor and ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts. Val cleaned slowly, her eyes sweeping across his desk, searching for anything that might be useful. She saw handwritten notes, numbers, names, addresses. She didn't understand all of their meaning, but she took out her old phone, the one she had bought from a pawn shop for $20, and photographed everything. Her hands shook as she pressed the button, her heart pounding as if it might burst. But she didn't stop. On the second night, she heard something far more important. Carlo held a meeting in VIP room 7, the room Val was usually assigned to clean after each night. She arrived earlier than usual and hid inside the cleaning supply cabinet in the corner, where there was a narrow crack just wide enough to see through. She had to wait nearly an hour in the cramped darkness, the smell of chemicals burning her nose, her legs numb from standing too long, but she didn't move. Then they came. Carlo Corsetti entered with 2 men Val had never seen before. They spoke English with a heavy Russian accent, and Val knew at once they were men of Dmitry Volkov, the Russian mafia boss Georgie had mentioned. "Tomorrow night, Corsetti will die," Carlo said, his voice cold, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the murder of his own cousin. "We'll take him to the southern warehouse and stage it as a fire. No evidence, no body, nothing." One of the Russians snorted. "And after that, I take over the Corsetti Empire," Carlo replied. "Volkov gets the weapons trade and the northern routes. The rest is mine. We've agreed on this. Don't get greedy." "Volkov wants to be sure Nathaniel is truly dead," the other Russian said, his tone threatening. "He's done business with Corsetti for 10 years. He doesn't want surprises." "He'll be dead," Carlo snarled. "I've waited for this for years. That bastard inherited everything while I, the older cousin, got nothing. My father served the Corsetti family his entire life and died in poverty, while Nathaniel sat on the throne like a prince. It's time for that to change." Val took out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it, and turned on the recorder. She recorded everything, every word, every laugh, every detail of the plan to kill Nate. They talked about the time, the location, who would be involved, how they would burn the warehouse to erase all traces. They talked about announcing that Nathaniel had gone missing on a business trip and that Carlo would assume power as the rightful heir. The meeting lasted nearly an hour, and when they finally left, Val remained inside the cabinet for another 10 minutes, barely daring to breathe, until she was certain no one remained outside. She stepped out, her legs trembling, her clothes soaked with sweat. But in her hand she held evidence, a weapon, something that could change everything. That night, at 4 a.m, she went down to the basement to see Nate as promised, bringing bread and water as usual, but this time she carried something far more important. She knelt beside him, opened her phone, and played the recording. In the damp darkness of the cell, Carlo Corsetti's voice rang out clearly, cold and merciless, laying out the plan to murder his own cousin. Nate listened, his gray eyes darkening, not with despair, but with something far more dangerous, the fury of a wounded beast that had finally identified the one who had stabbed it. When the recording ended, he looked at Val, and in his gaze, She no longer saw a prisoner waiting to die, but a boss calculating, planning, preparing to strike back. After listening to the recording, Nate told Val what he needed. Emilio Vargas, my bodyguard. The night I was taken, they shot him 3 times. I don't know if he's still alive, but if he is, he'll know how to contact whoever remains loyal. Theodore Walsh, my lawyer, is the one you need to find. If anyone can help, it's Theo. Val looked at him. She wanted to ask how a janitor like her was supposed to find a fugitive bodyguard and a lawyer from the upper circles, but she didn't ask. She only nodded and left, because she had learned that in this world, no one helps those who wait. Only those who find their own way survive. The next day, Val began to use the connections she had, the connections she thought she had buried along with her past. During 3 years working at Rico Santino's nightclub, she had met every kind of person. Drunk men who liked to confide in girls, braggarts who boasted about what they knew to impress, men who owed her silence because she had never repeated the secrets they spilled in the night. She went to one of them, an information broker named Mickey, a man who knew everything that happened in Chicago's underworld. Mickey looked at her in shock when she appeared. He hadn't expected her to be alive, and even less to dare come looking for him. I need to know where Emilio Vargas is, Val said, her voice cold and firm, no longer the trembling girl from 5 years earlier. I don't know, Mickey replied, but his eyes darted away. You do know, Val said, and you're going to tell me, because you still owe me. Do you remember the night you were drunk and told me about your deal with the Volkovs? If that information gets out, how long do you think you'll live? Mickey went pale, and 5 minutes later, Val had an address. Emilio was hiding in an abandoned hospital on the western outskirts, saved and concealed by a former prostitute. When Val found him, she saw a man lying on a broken bed, his chest wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still burning when he heard that Nate was alive. Emilio cried. The hardened man who had followed Nate since his youth cried like a child, tears running down his scarred face. I thought he was dead, he said, his voice breaking. I thought I had failed to protect him. Emilio gave Val Theodore Walsh's phone number and the address of his office, along with a list of loyal bodyguards who remained in hiding across the city. He also told her the locations of safe houses known only to Nate's closest circle. Val memorized everything, then left, leaving Emilio some food and medicine she had bought with her last saved money. Finding Theodore Walsh was harder than she had expected. He was a renowned lawyer, his office in an upscale downtown area, not a place someone like Val could enter without being thrown out. But she waited. She waited outside the building for 4 hours in the biting cold, until he finally stepped out alone at 9 in the evening. Mr. Walsh, she called, stepping out of the shadows. He startled, his hand going to his coat as if reaching for a weapon. Who are you? What do you want? I come from Nathaniel Corsetti, Val said quickly. He's alive. He needs your help. Theo's eyes widened. He looked around as if afraid of being watched, then pulled Val into a dark alley. What are you saying? Nate is alive. How do you know? Who are you? Val handed him her phone and played the recording of the meeting between Carlo and the Russians. Theo listened, his face shifting from shock to horror and then to fury. When the recording ended, he stood still for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists. My God, he whispered, his voice shaking. Carlo. It was Carlo. I should have known. What do you know? Val asked. Theo looked at her, his aging eyes full of pain. Nate's wife and son, Isabel and the boy. They died in a car bombing 3 years ago. Do you know that? No one ever found the culprit. Nate searched for 3 years, spent millions to hunt down whoever killed his family, but there were no leads. He paused and swallowed. But now, with what you just let me hear, with how Carlo planned everything, with how long he's been tied to Volkov, it all makes sense. Carlo killed them. He killed Isabel and the boy to weaken Nate, to prepare for today. Val felt the blood in her veins turn cold. She thought of Mia, thought of how someone could kill her daughter for a power scheme, and she understood the cruelty of this world more deeply than ever before. She also understood the pain Nate carried, the pain of a father who had lost his child and didn't know who the enemy was, until now. That night, when Val went down to the basement with the news she had just learned, she didn't know how to say it. How do you tell a man that the person who murdered his wife and child was his own blood, the one he had trusted for so many years? She sat down across from Nate, looked into the gray eyes she had grown familiar with, and she saw in them a fragile spark of hope, the hope that she was bringing good news, that the rescue plan was moving forward. But Val wasn't bringing good news. She was bringing the truth, and sometimes the truth was more brutal than death. "I found Emilio," she began, her voice soft, as if afraid of breaking something. "He's alive, badly wounded, but he'll recover. I also met Theodore Walsh." Nate nodded, his eyes lighting up. "Good, very good. With Emilio and Theo, we can." "There's one more thing," Val interrupted, and she saw Nate stop, sensing something in her tone, a heaviness that couldn't be hidden. "What is it?" Val drew a deep breath. "Theo told me about your wife and your son, about the car bombing 3 years ago." Nate went rigid, his gray eyes darkening like a sky before a storm. He said nothing, but his body tightened like a string about to snap. "Theo said you searched for the killer for 3 years without any leads," Val continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But now, with what I heard in Carlo's meeting, with how he's been preparing everything for so long, with how he's been tied to Volkov," she didn't need to finish the sentence. Nate understood. She saw the moment the truth pierced him like a bullet. The moment everything in his mind fell into place, forming a horrific picture he never wanted to see. "Carlo," he whispered, his voice flat in a way that was terrifying. "Carlo killed Isabel. Carlo killed my son." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A verdict. Val nodded, not knowing what to say in the face of the pain she was witnessing. Nate sat motionless, his gray eyes staring into nothingness, and she saw him collapsing from the inside, piece by piece, like a building brought down by explosives. "He was only 4 years old," Nate said, his voice shattering like glass. "He liked strawberry ice cream. He liked dinosaurs. Every morning he ran into my room, jumped on the bed, and said, 'Daddy, wake up.' He called Carlo, Uncle Carlo. He liked Uncle Carlo because he always bought him toys." Tears streamed down Nate's face. The first tears Val had seen him shed for himself and not for anyone else. He cried in silence, without sobs. Only tears and the absolute pain of a father who had lost everything and only now knew who his enemy was. Val didn't know what she was doing when she moved closer, when she placed her hand over his chained hand, when she held it tight as if she could pass some strength to him through that touch. She didn't speak, because there were no words that could ease this pain. She just stayed there, silent, with him in the darkness. They sat like that for a long time. It might have been minutes. It might have been an hour. Val didn't know. But then she felt the hand beneath hers change, from trembling to steady, from weakness to strength. When she looked up, she saw that Nate's gray eyes were no longer an abyss of pain. They had turned into fire, a cold and merciless fire more terrifying than anything she had ever seen. "I'll kill him," Nate said, his voice no longer shaking, no longer broken, only the cold certainty of a sentence already passed. "I'll tear him apart piece by piece, and I'll make him beg to die before I let him die." Val wasn't afraid when she heard those words. She should have been, but she wasn't. She understood. If someone did the same to Mia, she would say the same things. She would become a monster for revenge. "First you need to get out of here," she said. "You need to survive tomorrow night." Nate looked at her, and something shifted in his gaze when he looked at her. A softness amid all that hardness, a spark of light in the darkness. "Why are you still here, Valentina?" he asked. "You could have walked away a long time ago." Val looked at him, the man in chains, covered in blood, who had just learned the cruelest truth of his life. "Because sometimes," she said softly, "the ones the world has abandoned need to protect each other." The plan was put together over the next 24 hours, a race against time that Val didn't dare imagine failing. Emilio, though still weak, managed to contact 5 remaining loyal bodyguards hiding across the city, men who were willing to die for their boss. Theo prepared a car waiting at the casino's back exit and a safe bunker in the outskirts, a place even Carlo didn't know about because it had been secretly built by Nate's father decades earlier. Everything depended on timing, on precision, and on an old man who had sworn loyalty to the true Corsetti bloodline. That night, Carlo hosted a grand party on the upper floors of the casino to celebrate what he called the transfer of power. He invited allies, partners, and those he wanted to impress with his coming authority. Music thundered above, laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, while in the basement a rescue unfolded in silence. Val arrived at the casino at 10 in the evening as usual, wearing her familiar janitor uniform, pushing her cleaning cart through corridors no one bothered to glance at. She had done this thousands of times, and tonight looked no different to those around her. But in her pocket was her phone set to silent, waiting for Emilio's message that the car was ready at the back door. At 11:30, the message came. Val went down to the basement, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Georgie was already waiting there, his aged face tense but his eyes lit with something like release, as if he had been waiting for this moment for many years. "Move quickly," he said, leading Val to Nate's cell. He pulled out the key ring, his hand trembling slightly as he found the right key, then unlocked the steel door. Inside, Nate had already risen, his gray eyes flashing in the darkness when he saw them. Georgie stepped in, knelt beside him, and began unlocking the chains on his wrists and ankles. "Boss," he said, his voice choking. "I'm sorry. I should have done this sooner. I should have." "You've done enough, Georgie," Nate said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "You've been loyal to my family for 40 years. My father would be proud of you." The chains fell to the floor with a metallic clatter, and for the first time in days, Nate stood free. He staggered slightly, his legs weak from so long in irons, but Val quickly supported him, letting him lean on her shoulder. "We have to go," she said. "Emilio's waiting at the back door." They moved through the dark corridor, Georgie leading, Val supporting Nate, every step cautious as if they were walking on thin ice. They were nearly at the stairs to the first floor when everything collapsed. The door at the end of the corridor flew open and a figure stepped out, blocking their path. Rico Santino stood there, his eyes widening at the sight before him, then narrowing when he recognized Val. "You!" he hissed, his voice thick with shock and hatred. "You old whore, you're still alive. And you dare." His gaze flicked from Val to Nate to Georgie, and the truth struck his face like lightning. "You're helping Corsetti escape. You, a cheap whore I threw away like trash." Val froze as memories from 5 years earlier crashed over her like a tidal wave. The nights of abuse, the beatings, the humiliation of being tossed into the street like a stray dog, but she wasn't that girl anymore. She didn't tremble before him now. "Step aside, Rico," she said, her voice cold and firm. "You don't belong in this war." Rico laughed, the cruel laugh she had heard too many times in her nightmares. "Who do you think you are? What do you think you can do?" He reached toward his coat pocket, where Val knew a gun was hidden. But before he could touch the weapon, Nate moved, so fast Val couldn't follow it with her eyes. Even after days of torture, even with legs still shaking from the chains, Nate was still the Mafia boss who had survived countless battles. He lunged at Rico, one hand closing around his throat, the other ripping the gun from his pocket. Rico choked, eyes bulging, but he managed one last action before Nate crushed his windpipe. He pressed the alarm button on the phone, clipped to his belt, the alarm every one of Carlo's men carried. The alarm shrieked through the casino, tearing apart the basement's silence, and Val knew everything had just become 1,000 times more complicated. The alarm shriek tore through the air, echoing down the basement corridors like the screams of hell itself. Nate tightened his grip around Rico's throat until the man went limp, then hurled him to the floor like a sack of garbage. He took the gun from Rico's hand, checked the magazine, then turned to Val and Georgie with the eyes of a warrior ready for battle. "Run," he ordered. "Take the eastern emergency exit. Emilio is waiting there." They ran, Georgie leading them through a maze of corridors he knew by heart after 40 years working there. Heavy footsteps thundered behind them, shouts, the sound of guns being cocked, and Val knew Carlo's men were flooding the basement like wolves scenting prey. They turned left, then right, then left again, and Val completely lost her sense of direction. She only knew to follow Georgie's back ahead of her, fighting not to slip on the damp stone floor. Gunshots exploded behind them. Bullets whizzed past their heads and slammed into the walls, concrete dust filling the air. Nate turned and fired back. 2 shots, then 3, and Val heard someone cry out and fall, but she didn't dare look back. "The exit door is right ahead," Georgie shouted, his voice ragged with age and exertion. "Just 20 meters more." They ran like they had never run before. Val's lungs burned, her legs felt like lead, but she didn't stop. Mia was waiting for her. Her daughter was at home with Abuela Carmen, and she had to survive. She had to get back to her child. The steel door appeared ahead. Georgie lunged for it, twisted the handle, and light from outside spilled in like a promise of freedom. But at that moment, 3 of Carlo's men emerged from a side corridor, blocking their path. Nate fired, dropping one of them, but the other 2 dove for cover and returned fire relentlessly. They were trapped. The exit was right there, but they couldn't take another step without being cut down. "Go," Georgie suddenly said, his voice strangely calm amid the gunfire and chaos. "I'll hold them off." Nate turned toward him, gray eyes wide. Georgie. No. Boss. Georgie cut him off, and for the first time that night, he smiled. The peaceful smile of a man who had accepted his fate. I'm old. I've lived long enough. But you still have an empire to take back, enemies to punish. And he looked at Val, his smile growing warmer, and people who need you. Before Nate could argue, Georgie burst from cover, charging toward the two gunmen, shouting to draw their fire. Go now, he yelled, and this time Nate had no choice. He grabbed Val's hand, pulled her toward the exit, and they burst through the steel door just as gunshots rang out behind them. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. Val wanted to turn back, wanted to see what had happened to Georgie, but Nate wouldn't allow it. He dragged her through the dark alley behind the casino, where a black SUV sat idling. Emilio was behind the wheel, his face pale from wounds not yet fully healed, but his eyes blazing when he saw Nate. Boss! He shouted, throwing the door open. Get in! They jumped into the vehicle, and Emilio hit the gas immediately, the SUV shooting forward like a bullet tearing through the night. Behind them, gunfire still echoed from the casino. The alarm still screamed, but it was all fading, farther and farther away. Val sat in the back seat, gasping for breath, her body slick with cold sweat, and she realized her hand was gripping Nate's, or perhaps his hand was gripping hers. She wasn't sure anymore. She stared out the window at the streetlights streaking past like blurred trails of light, and she thought of Georgie, the old man who had died so they could live. Georgie, she whispered, her voice breaking. Nate didn't answer, but she felt his hand tighten, and when she turned to look at him, she saw his gray eyes shimmering in the darkness. He was the last man loyal to my father, Nate said, his voice low and aching. He served the Corsetti family for 40 years, and he died with a smile, because he knew he had kept his oath. Silence filled the car, a heavy silence of grief and loss. Val didn't know what to say. She just held Nate's hand, letting him know she was there, that he wasn't alone. Emilio drove through the dark streets of Chicago toward the outskirts, toward the safe bunker where they could hide and plan their counterstrike. But Val wasn't thinking about that. She was thinking of Mia, of her daughter at home with Abuela Carmen, of the fact that she needed to get back to her child right away. Mia, she said urgently, my daughter. I need to get to her. Nate looked at her and nodded. Emilio, go to her place first. The car stopped in front of the old apartment building on the south side, and Val jumped out before the wheels had fully stopped. She ran through the main entrance whose lock had been broken for years, took the stairs 3 steps at a time, her heart pounding as if it would burst from her chest. Something was wrong. She felt it in her bones, in her blood, a mother's instinct that needed no explanation. When she reached the 3rd floor, in front of Abuela Carmen's apartment number 37, Val froze. The door had been smashed in, the hinges torn loose, splintered wood scattered across the hallway floor. No, she whispered, her voice shaking. No, no, no. She rushed inside, and the world collapsed beneath her feet. The small apartment had been ransacked, furniture overturned, belongings strewn everywhere. Abuela Carmen lay motionless on the floor, blood running from her head, a long wound on her forehead staining her silver hair red. Val threw herself beside her, dropped to her knees, trembling hands checking for a pulse. Alive. She was alive, but Mia was not there. Val ran through the apartment, calling her daughter's name, her voice growing frantic. Mia, Mia, where are you? There was no answer, no sound of her child, only a terrifying silence and the thick metallic smell of blood in the air. Nate stepped in, Emilio close behind, and both froze at the sight. Nate scanned the room, gray eyes sweeping like a predator assessing danger. Then his gaze stopped at the small table by the window. A piece of paper lay there, placed neatly as if someone wanted to be sure it would be found. He walked over, picked it up, and his face changed as he read the words. Val, he called, his voice tight. Val ran to him, snatched the paper from his hand, and read, each word like a bullet tearing through her heart. If you want the girl alive, trade the life of Corsetti. Southern Warehouse. 12, midnight tomorrow. Come alone. Volkov. The paper slipped from Val's fingers, drifting to the floor like a dry leaf. She stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to think. Mia, her daughter, the 5-year-old child she lived for, was now in the hands of a monster. A man who killed without blinking. A Russian Mafia boss notorious for torturing his victims before killing them. Val's knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor, a raw scream ripping from her throat, the cry of a mother who had just lost everything. Mia, my daughter. They took my daughter. Tears streamed down her face, her body shaking uncontrollably, and she screamed again and again until her voice broke and only choked sobs remained. Nate knelt beside her, his strong hands gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Val, he said, his voice hard but carrying something deeper beneath it, something like the pain he himself had once endured. Look at me, look at me. Val lifted her head, brown eyes red and swollen from crying, her face twisted with agony. They'll kill my child, she said, her voice shattered. They won't have the chance. Nate cut in, his gray eyes igniting with a fire she had never seen before. The fire of a man who once ruled all of Chicago, the fire of a father who had lost a child and understood exactly what she was suffering. I swear to you, Val, I'll get her back. I'll kill anyone who dares touch her. And I'll bring her back to you, even if it costs me my life. You don't understand, Val sobbed, clutching his coat like a drowning woman clinging to a lifeline. You don't understand what they'll do to my child. I do understand, Nate said, his voice dropping, raw as an old wound torn open. I understand more than anyone. I lost my son, and I won't let you lose your daughter. Not because of me. Not tonight. Not ever. He stood up and turned to Emilio, his gray eyes no longer those of a prisoner who had just escaped, but of a boss preparing for war. Call everyone. Call Theo. Call Bobby Sullivan. Call anyone still loyal. We don't wait until tomorrow night. We strike tonight. The safe house on the outskirts of Chicago turned into a command center in less than 2 hours. Emilio contacted everyone who was still loyal, and they arrived one by one, silent as ghosts in the night. 5 bodyguards who had followed Nate since the earliest days, men who had escaped the ambush on the night he was captured and gone into hiding to wait for a chance. Theodore Walsh arrived carrying a briefcase packed with information on Volkov's properties, including the southern warehouse where Mia was being held. Detective Bobby Sullivan, the cop whose daughter Nate had saved from traffickers years ago, brought detailed maps of the area and intelligence on how many gunmen Volkov usually deployed. The bunker filled with people, the smell of gun oil, sweat, and tension mixing thickly in the air. Nate stood at the center of the room before a large map spread across the table, and Val watched him as if she were looking at an entirely different man. This was no longer the man in chains she had found in a dark basement, no longer the prisoner waiting to die to whom she had brought bread and water. This was Nathaniel Corsetti, the boss of Chicago, the man the entire city feared, and now she understood why. He gave orders with cold precision, assigning tasks like a general before battle, his eyes sweeping over each person with a sharp gaze that measured strengths and weaknesses. Volkov has around 20 gunmen guarding the warehouse, Bobby Sullivan said, pointing at the map. They rotate shifts, 8 per shift, 4 outside and 4 inside. Carlo is at his penthouse celebrating his early victory, unaware that Nate has escaped. We split into 2 teams, Nate decided. Team 1 hits the warehouse and rescues the girl. Team 2 breaches the penthouse and takes Carlo alive. I'll lead Team 1. Boss, Emilio spoke up, his voice tight with concern. You're not fully recovered yet. Your injuries. I don't care, Nate cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. The girl is in Volkov's hands because of me. Her mother risked her life to save mine, and now her child is paying the price. I'll bring her back myself, or I'll die trying. The meeting went on for another hour, every detail carefully discussed, every contingency prepared. When the others dispersed to gather weapons and gear, Val remained seated in the corner, her eyes fixed on nothing, her mind with Mia, imagining the terrible things her child might be enduring. Nate came over and sat across from her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. You should stay here, he finally said. This place is safe. I'll bring Mia back to you. Val lifted her head, brown eyes meeting gray. I want to come with you. No, you'll die. I don't care. Nate looked at her, and she saw his jaw tighten, saw his eyes flare with something she couldn't quite read. I care, he said quietly. What do you think I'm fighting for tonight? My empire. Money. Power. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. I'm fighting for you. For the girl. Because for the first time in 3 years, I have a reason to live that isn't revenge. Val froze, unable to believe what she was hearing. I don't know what to call it, Nate continued, his voice rough as if these words were being dragged from a place he had sealed shut for years. When you walked into that dark room with bread and water, When you looked at me like a human being and not a monster. When you held my hand the night I learned the truth about Isabel and my son, you changed something in me. I thought that part of me died with my family 3 years ago. Turns out, it was only waiting for someone to wake it up. He raised his hand and touched her cheek, and Val felt the warmth of his palm spread through her cold skin. I'll bring Mia back. I swear it. But you have to stay here. You have to live. Because if you die, then even if I win tonight, I've already lost. Tears slid down Val's cheeks. She didn't know whether they were for fear of Mia, for the weight of Nate's words, or for both. She caught his hand against her face and held it tight, as if it were the only lifeline in a black sea. You have to come back, she said, her voice breaking. Do you hear me? You have to bring Mia home and you have to come back with her. You can't die. Nate smiled, the first smile she had seen on his lips that held no pain or bitterness. A real smile, gentle and warm enough to make her chest ache. I'll try, he said. For you. Then he stood and returned to his men, and Val watched his back, praying to whatever god might be listening that this would not be the last time she ever saw him. The southern warehouse sat on the edge of an abandoned industrial zone, a massive red brick building with shattered windows and weeds choking the ground around it. It was a moonless night. Darkness draped over everything like a black blanket, and that was exactly the advantage Nate needed. His team moved in from 3 directions, silent as ghosts, neutralizing the outer guards before they could raise the alarm. Nate led the main group, gun in hand, gray eyes sweeping the shadows with the focus of a predator. He had done this hundreds of times before, stormed enemy strongholds and walked out with blood on his hands. But tonight was different. Tonight wasn't about power or money. Tonight was for a 5-year-old girl who had given him a piece of candy when he was chained to a wall, and for the mother who had saved him when the whole world turned its back. They burst into the warehouse through the rear entrance. Gunfire tore through the silence. Shouts echoed. Boots pounded. Bullets slammed into walls and tore through flesh. Nate fired without hesitation. Every shot precise and lethal, moving through rusted shelving and old shipping containers like a destructive storm. Emilio stayed at his side, covering his flank. His wound hadn't fully healed, but he fought like there was no tomorrow. They pushed deeper into the warehouse, leaving bodies behind them and pools of blood spreading across the concrete floor. Then they reached the main chamber, a vast open space at the heart of the building, where Dmitry Volkov waited with a cruel smile. He was around 50, silver hair cropped short, a scarred face shaped by too many wars survived. Beside him, one of his men held Mia, a knife pressed to the child's throat. Val could see the girl trembling, tears streaking her cheeks, but she wasn't crying out, as if she already knew that crying wouldn't save her. Corsetti, Volkov said, his voice thick with a Russian accent and contempt. You came sooner than I expected. I thought you'd wait until tomorrow night like we agreed. The girl can be anywhere as long as you let her go, Nate replied, his voice ice cold, gray eyes never leaving Mia or the blade at her throat. Mia saw him then, and her big eyes lit up with a fragile spark of hope. Uncle Candy, she whispered, her voice shaking but no longer consumed by fear. Nate felt his chest tighten at the sound of those words. Memories of his son flooding back, of a 4-year-old boy who had called him silly names just like that, a child now buried because of blood betrayal. He couldn't let it happen again. He wouldn't let it happen again. What do you want? Nate asked, eyes locked on Volkov, while his mind calculated every possible move. Your life, Volkov laughed. You trade your life for the girl. Fair, right. A boss for a worthless child. Sounds like a good deal to me. Nate nodded slowly, as if considering it. Fine. Let the girl go. Your gun first. Nate set the gun down and raised his hands. Volkov signaled his men to move in, and in that exact moment, a single gunshot cracked from above, from a broken window no one had noticed. Emilio, now a sniper, had climbed up there while Nate drew attention, and his bullet went straight through the head of the man holding Mia with deadly precision. Chaos exploded. Nate lunged for Mia, pulling her into his arms and using his body as a shield as bullets rained down. One round tore through his shoulder, pain searing like fire, but he didn't stop. He clutched the shaking child and rolled behind a shipping container, protecting her from the storm of gunfire ripping through the room. The fight was brutal. Nate's team took heavy losses. 2 men fell in the first minutes, but they didn't retreat. One by one, Volkov's men went down. Positions were seized, ground reclaimed, until only Volkov remained, wounded in the leg, slumped against a wall with an empty gun in his hand. Nate stepped toward him, blood running from his shoulder down his arm, gray eyes unwavering. You know what happens now, Volkov said, still sneering even with death inches away. Carlo will see me after I'm done with you. Nate cut him off. He raised his gun and without another word pulled the trigger. Volkov collapsed, his head jerking before falling to the side, eyes staring blankly at the warehouse ceiling. Nate turned and walked back to where Mia sat curled behind the container, wide eyes filled with fear and trust all at once. He knelt and gently wrapped his arms around her. Mia clung to his neck and sobbed. "Uncle Candy," she cried. "I was so scared. I want my mom." "I know," Nate said softly, his voice so gentle it was hard to believe this was the same man who had just killed Volkov without blinking. "I'm taking you back to your mom. I promise." While Nate was attacking the warehouse, the second team had breached Carlo's penthouse and captured him with little effort. Carlo was drunk, celebrating, and he didn't even understand what was happening before he was knocked unconscious and bound. Now he was kneeling on the cold concrete floor of the safe bunker, hands tied behind his back, face swollen and bruised from blows, and standing before him was Nathaniel Corsetti, the cousin he had been certain was already dead. Val stood in the corner of the room. Mia was asleep in the room next door after Nate's private doctor examined her and confirmed she had no injuries beyond shock. Val didn't want to be there. She didn't want to witness what was about to happen, but she needed the truth. She needed to hear it from the mouth of the man who had nearly killed her child. "Cousin," Nate said, his voice so cold the air in the room seemed to freeze. "I know you killed Isabel and my son." Carlo lifted his head. His eyes were still bloodshot from alcohol, now flooded with fear. How do you know?" "Her," Nate said, pointing at Val. "The woman this entire empire treated like trash. She found out everything when no one else could." Carlo looked at Val, hatred and contempt flashing in his eyes. "That whore! You let a gunshot exploded. The bullet tore through Carlo's knee. Bone and blood burst outward. He screamed and collapsed onto the floor. "Never call her that," Nate said, the gun still smoking. "Next time it's the other knee. After that, it's what's between your legs. And I'll keep going until you have nothing left." Carlo writhed on the floor, tears and mucus mixing with blood. A pathetic ruin of a man who once thought he would rule all of Chicago. All right, he screamed, his voice warped by pain. "I'll talk. I'll tell you everything." And he did. He spoke of how he had hated Nate for years. Hated that Nate inherited everything while he, the older cousin, got nothing. He told how he had contacted Volkov 5 years earlier, laying out the plan step by step to seize the throne, and he told of the car bombing 3 years before. How he hired men to plant the bomb in Isabel's car. How he watched from a distance as it exploded, killing Nate's wife and son. "I didn't think the kid would be in the car," Carlo said, his voice trembling as if that could excuse anything. "I just wanted to kill your wife, break you, make you easier to control. I didn't know you took the boy to school that day." Nate stood motionless, gray eyes fixed on Carlo without blinking. Val could see Nate's hand shaking, not from fear, but from restraining a fury powerful enough to burn the world down. "My son was 4 years old," Nate said, his voice terrifyingly flat. "He called you Uncle Carlo. He loved it when you bought him toys. Every time he saw you, he ran to hug your legs and laugh." Carlo sobbed, tears streaming down his bloodied face. "Brother, please. We're blood. Your father and mine were brothers. You can't." "You killed my blood," Nate cut him off, stepping closer, gun aimed at Carlo's head. "You killed my 4-year-old son. You killed my wife. You took my family and left me in hell for 3 years, not knowing who my enemy was. You think blood still means anything after that?" Carlo screamed and begged and wept, but Nate didn't listen. He stood there, looking down at the man who destroyed his life, and in his gray eyes there was no mercy, no hesitation, only the cold justice of the underworld. "My son," Nate said, his voice like ice. "His name was Marcus. You were the uncle he trusted, the one who bought him toys while planning to turn his laughter into silence. He wanted to be an astronaut when he grew up. He'll never grow up." He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the bunker, then silence. Carlo Corsetti lay motionless on the concrete, blood pooling from the bullet hole in his forehead, eyes wide open in eternal horror. Val stood in the corner and witnessed it all, and she wasn't afraid. She understood. In this world, this was the only justice that existed, and sometimes justice was the color of blood. 3 months had passed since that blood-soaked night, and Chicago had slowly returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Nathaniel Corsetti had fully reclaimed his power, the Corsetti Empire stronger than ever after the traitors were purged, and those who remained understood the price of disloyalty. He changed many things in how the empire operated, shutting down nightclubs like the ones Rico Santino once ran, completely erasing the human trafficking operations he had always despised, and redirecting money into more legitimate businesses instead of drugs. People said the boss had changed, that coming so close to death had softened him, but Val knew the truth was far more complicated. She knew Nate was still ruthless when necessary, still capable of killing without blinking if anyone threatened what he protected. But he was also the man who carried Mia all the way home from the blood-drenched warehouse, the man who promised to protect her and her daughter at any cost. Val and Mia lived under Nate's protection in a safe apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, far from the South Side slums where they had endured so many years. The 2-bedroom apartment was clean, with large windows overlooking a park, a heating system that actually worked, and a refrigerator always full of food. It felt like paradise compared to the damp single room they once lived in. But Val refused to live in Nate's mansion despite his repeated invitations. "I don't need your money," she told him one evening when he came to visit. "I want to stand on my own feet. I've relied on men for too long, and I don't want Mia growing up thinking women have to depend on someone else to survive." Nate didn't get angry and didn't push her. He simply nodded with a respect Val had never received from any man before. Instead, he helped her open a small bakery on a street corner, not by giving her money, but by lending it with 0 interest and no deadline for repayment. "This is clean work," he said. "Work you can be proud of. Work Mia can talk about when she grows up." The bakery was called Mia's Kitchen, and Val worked there from early morning until evening, kneading dough, baking bread, serving customers with a smile she thought she had forgotten how to wear. Her hands were no longer raw from cleaning chemicals, replaced by flour and sugar, sweetness instead of bitterness. Mia attended a decent elementary school, had friends, toys, and a life Val had never dared to dream she could give her child. But between Val and Nate there was a distance they both felt, and neither dared to cross. Nate visited them often, played with Mia, taught her to read as he had promised, bought her stuffed animals and picture books. Mia called him Uncle Nate, and loved him like a father she never had. Yet every time Nate's eyes met Val's, every time their hands accidentally brushed, they both pulled back, as if afraid that taking one more step would make everything collapse. One night, after Mia had fallen asleep, Nate came to the bakery while Val was cleaning up after closing. He sat at the small table by the window, watching her work, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "I used to be a prostitute," Val suddenly said, her voice soft but trembling, as if she were finally releasing something that had weighed on her for months. "You're a Mafia boss. You have power, money, the whole world at your feet. And me, I'm a woman with a filthy past that nothing can ever wash clean. This can't." "Can't what?" Nate asked, standing and stepping closer. Val backed up until her spine touched the counter. "People will talk. They'll say you've lost your mind for being with someone like me. They'll..." "Let them," Nate cut in, his gray eyes fixed on her with a sincerity she had never seen in anyone. "I don't care what you used to be. I care who you are. And you're the woman who saved me when I had nothing, who saw me when the whole world turned its back, who taught me there was still something worth living for beyond revenge." He raised his hand and touched her cheek, and Val felt tears sliding down her skin, not knowing when she had started crying. "I lost my wife and child once," Nate said, his voice lowering. "I don't want to lose you and Mia because of what people think, because of the fear you're carrying, because of a past you weren't guilty of." Val looked at him, the most powerful man in Chicago, standing before her with eyes full of wounds and hope, and she realized they were both afraid. Afraid of being hurt again, afraid of losing something precious. But maybe, just maybe, they could face that fear together. Another 6 months passed, and the relationship between Val and Nate grew slowly but steadily, like roots gripping deep into the soil. They didn't rush, didn't force anything, letting everything unfold naturally the way it needed to. Nate came to the bakery every evening after closing, helped Val clean up, then they sat drinking coffee and talking, sometimes about important things, sometimes about the small, ordinary moments of the day. He had dinner with Val and Mia at least 3 times a week, learned how to cook simple dishes Mia liked, learned how to read fairy tales using different voices for each character just to make her laugh. Mia called him Uncle Nate and loved him like a father. And one night, as Val was tucking her into bed, the little girl asked a question that made Val's heart tighten. "Mom, can Uncle Nate be my dad?" Val didn't know how to answer. She only held her daughter close and promised she would talk to Uncle Nate, even though she didn't know what she would say. but Nate seemed to have his own answer already. One evening at the end of May, when spring was giving way to summer and the Chicago air was turning warm, he came to pick Val up after closing, not in his usual black SUV, but in a sleek limousine. "Where are we going?" Val asked, surprised. "There's a place I want to show you," Nate replied as he opened the door for her. "A place I've never taken anyone." They drove through the city, past familiar streets and neighborhoods Val had never set foot in, until the car stopped in front of a towering skyscraper downtown, one of the tallest buildings in Chicago. Nate led her inside, through the elegant lobby, into a private elevator, up to the top floor, then up a narrow stairway that led to the rooftop. When the metal door opened, Val froze at the sight before her. All of Chicago stretched out below, millions of lights sparkling like stars fallen to the ground, Lake Michigan reflecting the moonlight along the horizon, and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of the coming summer. Nate stepped to the edge of the rooftop and looked down at the city, and Val saw his shoulders tense, as if he were preparing to say something incredibly difficult. "This is my darkest place," he said, his voice low and distant. 3 years ago, after Isabel and Marcus died, I came here. I stood right here, looking down, thinking that one more step would end all the pain. Val felt her heart skip a beat. She moved beside him, standing close, saying nothing, only listening. "I stood here for hours," Nate continued. "I thought about jumping. I thought about ending everything. But I stepped back, not because I wanted to live, but because I needed to find who killed my family. Revenge was the only thing keeping me tied to this world." He turned to look at Val, gray eyes shining beneath the moonlight. "But you gave me another reason, a much better one." Val felt tears well up, words caught in her throat. Nate reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small black velvet box, and knelt in front of her. Val's heart raced, her knees nearly buckled, and she couldn't believe what was happening. "Valentina Mendez," Nate said as he opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring engraved with a delicate rose, not an expensive diamond or glittering gemstone, but the very thing she once said she loved in a conversation she thought he'd forgotten. "You saved me from the darkness. You saw me when I was invisible to the world. You gave me hope when I thought I had nothing left. You taught me that life still has meaning beyond revenge and pain." He paused and took a deep breath, and Val saw his eyes glisten, not from the city lights, but from tears the most powerful man in Chicago was fighting back. "I don't deserve you. I know that. I have blood on my hands, sins in my past, darkness in my soul. But I want to spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of you. I want to wake up every morning and see you beside me. I want to watch Mia grow up and be called Dad. I want to build a family with you, a real family. Not because of power or money, but because of love." He looked straight into her eyes, his voice trembling but sincere. "Valentina, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Val's face, and she didn't try to stop them. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the man the whole city once saw as a monster, yet who was gentler with her and her daughter than anyone else had ever been, the man who nearly died for her and killed dozens to save Mia. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking with happiness. "Yes, I will." Nate stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and then kissed her on the rooftop of the tallest building in Chicago, beneath a sky full of stars. Two souls abandoned by the world, finally finding each other in the darkness and choosing to step into the light together. The wedding didn't take place in a grand cathedral downtown, or a 5-star hotel favored by the elite. It was held in the small street, Michael's Church on the south side, where Father Patrick Brennan, the elderly priest who had been the only one never to judge Val through her hardest years, officiated the ceremony. It was Val's choice, and Nate agreed without a word of objection, because he understood that this wedding wasn't about displaying power or wealth, but about two people who found each other in the darkness and chose to step into the light together. That August morning, sunlight streamed through the church's stained glass windows, casting shimmering colors across the worn wooden floor. The small church was filled, not with unfamiliar faces from high society, but with the people who truly mattered in Val and Nate's lives. Abuela Carmen sat in the front pew, tears already falling before the ceremony even began, the woman who saved Val 5 years earlier now watching her step into a new life. Val's former co-workers from her days as a janitor were there, people who had been overlooked and dismissed just like her, now dressed in the finest clothes they owned, proud that one of their own had risen. Emilio stood beside Nate as best man, his wounds fully healed, while Theo sat a few rows back with a rare smile on his otherwise stern face. Nate's loyal guards were there too, the men who had once been ready to die for him and were now witnessing him find happiness. Then the church doors opened and Val stepped inside. She wore a simple yet elegant wedding dress, ivory white with delicate lace. Not a sweeping gown with a long train, but a knee-length dress that suited the simplicity she had always loved. Her hair fell loose, adorned with small roses, and she wore no jewelry except the engagement ring Nate had placed on her finger on the rooftop. But the one who captured every heart wasn't Val. It was Mia, 6 years old, walking ahead of her mother, scattering white rose petals along the aisle. She wore a full white dress, her hair braided into 2 small plaits tied with pink ribbons, and her face held the brightest smile Val had ever seen. Mia scattered the petals with complete seriousness, as if this were the most important mission of her life, and every small step she took brought tender smiles from everyone present. When Val and Mia reached the altar, Nate stood waiting in a formal black suit, but his gray eyes didn't linger on the dress or the flowers. He looked only at Val, as if she were the only thing that existed in the room, in the world. Father Patrick began with prayers and blessings, then came the vows. Nate took Val's hand, his voice low and steady as he spoke. "I don't promise to be perfect, because I'm not. I have blood on my hands, sins in my past, darkness in my soul that might never fully disappear. But I promise to use everything I have, my strength, my power, and even my ruthlessness when it's needed, to protect you and Mia. I promise to love you not because you're perfect, but because you're you, with every scar and every piece of your past. And I promise you'll never be alone again. Never have to be afraid alone. Never have to fight alone." Val tightened her grip on his hand, tears sliding down her cheeks as she began her own vow. "I used to believe I didn't deserve love. I thought my past would forever define my future. But you proved me wrong. You saw me when I was invisible to the world. You trusted me when no one else did. You gave me the strength to stand and the reason to keep moving forward. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you. Whether it's light or darkness, joy or pain." Father Patrick declared them husband and wife, and when Nate kissed Val, the church erupted in applause. But the sound they heard most clearly was Mia's joyful voice as she shouted that now we're a family. She squeezed in between them and wrapped her arms around them both. And in that moment, inside a small church on the south side, 3 people abandoned by the world finally found where they belonged. In the year 2036, 12 years after the wedding, the Corsetti estate in the suburbs of Chicago was filled with laughter on a Sunday morning in April. Mia, now 17, sat by the living room window, with a thick law book in her hands. She wanted to become a lawyer to protect women like her mother once was, women abandoned by society with no one willing to stand on their side. Nate had officially adopted her shortly after the wedding, and she carried the Corsetti name with a pride nothing could shake. Marco Nathaniel Corsetti, 10 years old, the first son of Nate and Val, was in his father's office, learning how to read financial reports with a seriousness far beyond his age. He looked exactly like his father, sharp gray eyes and a strong square jaw, yet inside him lived his mother's gentle heart, always ready to help those weaker than himself. The twins, Isabel Rose and Luna Marie, 7 years old, named after Nate's late wife and Val's departed mother, were running through the vast garden, their clear laughter echoing like music. The 2 girls looked identical, long black hair and their mother's brown eyes, yet their smiles were unmistakably their father's. Anthony James, 4 years old, the youngest of the family, toddled after his sisters on small, unsteady legs, his unusually blue eyes inherited from his grandmother, and a fierce spirit that refused to be outdone despite being the smallest. Nate, now 50, his hair almost completely gray, yet his frame still strong, sat on the porch watching his children play with a look no one would have believed possible 12 years earlier, the look of a happy and fulfilled father. He had withdrawn from most illegal activities, shifting the Corsetti empire into legitimate businesses, retaining power but a cleaner kind of power, the kind his children could be proud of. Val stepped onto the porch with a tray of lemonade, 40 years old, her hair still dark with only a few silver strands, her hands no longer roughened by chemicals but softened by dough and love. She had founded a charity to support women who wanted to leave the streets, teaching them skills, giving them safe shelter and a chance to rebuild their lives. Money from the Corsetti empire flowed into it as a way to atone for the past and as a promise to the future. Anthony ran to his mother, tugging at her dress with shining blue eyes. "Mom, tell the story about how you saved Dad." It was the children's favorite story, even though they had heard it hundreds of times. the tale of a brave mother and a father who was once a monster before finding love. Val and Nate looked at each other and smiled. Then the whole family gathered on the porch beneath the shade of the old oak tree Nate had planted on their wedding day. Once upon a time, Val began, her voice warm and tender. There was a very ordinary woman working in a very dark place, and she met a monster locked in a basement, Marco continued, knowing every word by heart. But the monster wasn't truly evil, Mia said, looking at her adoptive father with affection. He was just waiting for someone to see him. Nate pulled Val into his arms and kissed her hair. And when she saw him, the monster realized he had found a reason to live. "Daddy," Isabel Rose asked in her clear voice, "are you still a monster?" Nate looked at his daughter, then at Val, then at all the children he never believed he would have. "I still have a part of the monster," he answered honestly. "But that part only wakes up to protect the people I love. With this family, I only want to be Dad." As the sun set over Chicago, the Corsetti family sat together, laughter ringing out, the scent of roses from the garden Val had planted drifting on the evening breeze. In the darkness, they found one another, and in the light, they built a home. Their story is proof that love can grow from the darkest places, that redemption can come from hands the world has abandoned, and that human dignity isn't measured by past or origin, but by the choices we make when facing adversity. This story reminds us never to judge anyone by appearances or by what they have endured, because within every person lies the ability to change, a light waiting for someone to see it. It also teaches us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act while trembling with it, and that sometimes it only takes one person who doesn't turn away to change an entire life. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can keep bringing you moving stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of something in your own life? Please leave a comment below. We truly look forward to hearing what's in your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.